He was the world's most famous killer, yet he died a terrified victim. Anthony Perkins spent a lifetime scaring audiences, but in the end, he was the one trembling in the dark. While AIDS ravaged his body, Hollywood didn't offer mercy. They offered a threat: hide the sickness or lose everything. He was forced to paint over his dying flesh, playing the role of a healthy star while rotting from the inside. Join us as we uncover the brutal, heartbreaking truth behind the silence. Anthony Perkins was born in 1932 in New York to Osgood Perkins and Janet Raine. Osgood was the king of Broadway, a war hero, and an intimidating, strict figure who was rarely home. In his absence, Janet, who was unhappy and much younger, focused all her emotional energy on Anthony. Anthony was a sickly, sensitive child caught between a distant, terrifying father and a mother who smothered him with affection. In 1937, at age 5, Anthony felt he disappointed his tough father. Jealous and wanting his mother to himself, he secretly wished his father would go away. On September 21st, Osgood suddenly died of a heart attack. Anthony believed his wish had literally caused his father's death. This created a deep, secret guilt. He forced himself to be the perfect son on the outside, to hide the killer he believed he was on the inside. This psychological split, protecting the mother while hiding a dark secret, mirrored the character of Norman Bates 20 years before the movie existed. With Osgood gone, the barriers between Janet and Anthony dissolved completely. They moved to a smaller, more insular world. They became a closed loop. Me and you against the world, Tony. Janet Raine was not abusive in the way we typically understand violence. She didn't beat him. She didn't starve him. Her abuse was insidious. It was emotional incest. She treated Anthony not as a child to be raised, but as a confidant, a partner, a surrogate husband. She undressed in front of him with a casualness that blurred boundaries. She discussed adult topics, adult fears and adult emotions with a boy who was still playing with toy soldiers. She monitored his every move. She controlled his diet, his clothes, his friends. She projected her own anxieties onto him. If she was cold, Tony had to wear a sweater. If she was sad, Tony had to be quiet. He learned to read her micro-expressions like a survival map. He became hyper-vigilant. He learned that love was not about being seen. It was about mirroring the needs of the other person. This is where the actor was born. Anthony Perkins didn't start acting on a stage. He started acting in his living room. He played the role of the perfect son to keep his mother stable. He suppressed his own anger, his own desires, his own confusion, and presented a mask of eager-to-please compliance. But the body keeps the score. As he entered puberty, the closeness with his mother became confusing and terrifying. He was developing sexual urges, but the primary female figure in his life was forbidden territory that felt too close. This dynamic warped his developing sexuality. Intimacy with women became associated with engulfment, with control, with the feeling of being smothered. Conversely, the world of men, the world of his dead father, became a mysterious, distant fantasy. He craved the masculine connection he had lost, but he was terrified of it because he felt he wasn't man enough to claim it. He was stuck in the velvet cage of his mother's apartment, a bird with clipped wings being told how lucky he was to be safe. In 1942, as the world burned in the fires of the Second World War, Janet made a decision that felt like a betrayal. She sent Anthony away. Perhaps she sensed the unhealthy intensity of their bond. Perhaps she simply wanted him to have the elite education that Osgood had. She enrolled him at the Brooks School in North Andover, Massachusetts. For the 10-year-old Anthony, this was not an adventure. It was an exile. He was ripped from the womb-like safety of the apartment and thrown into the shark tank of an all-boys boarding school. He was unprepared. He was physically frail, socially awkward, and deeply effeminate in his mannerisms, a byproduct of being raised exclusively by a dominant mother. In the hyper-masculine, aggressive environment of a 1940s boarding school, he was blood in the water. The bullying was relentless. He was mocked for his stutter. He was mocked for his lack of athletic ability. He was called sissy, fairy, mama's boy. Words that cut deeper than knives because they echoed his own internal fears. He wasn't like the other boys. He didn't care about football. He didn't care about roughhousing. He felt like an alien species. He withdrew. He spent his time in the library, losing himself in books. He developed a defensive shell. He learned to use his intellect as a weapon. If he couldn't beat them with his fists, he would outsmart them. He developed a sharp, biting wit. He learned to deflect, to use sarcasm to keep people at arm's length. It was during these miserable years at Brooks and later at the Brown and Nichols School that he discovered the only place where he felt powerful, the theater. Acting wasn't a hobby for Anthony Perkins. It was an exorcism. When he stepped onto a stage, the stutter vanished. The anxiety evaporated. The guilt of his father's death, the suffocating presence of his mother, the cruelty of his classmates, it all disappeared. On stage, he could be someone else. He could be brave. He could be strong. He could be loud. He had inherited Osgood's gift. It was undeniable. He had a natural magnetic presence. He was tall, gangly, but he moved with a strange hypnotic grace. He realized that the very things that made him a victim in the locker room, his sensitivity, his emotional transparency, made him a god under the spotlight. At 15, he joined a summer stock theater company in Brattleboro, Vermont. It was his first taste of freedom. For the first time, he was around people who were like him, misfits, artists, dreamers. He was no longer the weird kid. He was the talented son of Osgood Perkins. But even here, the shadow of his father loomed. The older actors looked at him and said, "You look just like Osgood. You move just like Osgood." He was being praised, but he was being praised for being a ghost. He wasn't being seen for himself. He was being seen as a sequel. During these teenage years, the sexual confusion that had been simmering began to boil over. He found himself attracted to the other boys in the theater company. This was the late 1940s. The word gay was not in common usage. The concept was shrouded in shame and criminality. Perkins didn't have a vocabulary for what he was feeling. He only knew it was wrong. He only knew it was another secret he had to keep, another reason to hate himself. He threw himself into his work with a fanaticism that bordered on obsession. If he worked hard enough, if he was successful enough, maybe he could outrun the shame. Maybe he could buy his redemption with applause. Perkins graduated and moved on to Rollins College in Florida, and later to Columbia University in New York. By the early 1950s, he was transforming. The awkward, bullied boy was gone. In his place stood a young man of striking, unconventional beauty. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, lean as a greyhound, with dark, intense eyes and a smile that seemed to hide 1,000 secrets. He was intelligent, well-read, and charming. But it was a calculated charm. At Columbia, he perfected the art of the double agent. By day, he was the serious student of history and literature. He dated girls attending dances and mixers, playing the part of the eligible bachelor. He knew the script of heterosexuality by heart, and he performed it flawlessly. But by night, he began to explore the underground geography of New York City. He walked the streets of Greenwich Village. He felt the pull of a world that was dangerous and electric. He had his first encounters with men, fleeting, terrified, exhilarating. These encounters were not joyful. They were laced with the fear of arrest and the fear of exposure. Every time he touched another man, he felt he was betraying his mother and confirming the sickness inside him. He would wash himself compulsively afterwards, trying to scrub away the desire. He was living in a state of constant, high-wire tension. One slip, one wrong look at the wrong person, and his life would be over. This tension gave his acting a vibrating, nervous energy that was impossible to look away from. He looked like a man who was about to explode. And Hollywood was watching. In 1953, the call came. MGM was casting for a film called The Actress, based on the life of Ruth Gordon. They needed a young man to play the suitor. It was a small role, but it was a foot in the door. Perkins flew to Los Angeles. He walked onto the soundstage and the camera fell in love with him. He didn't look like the other stars of the era. He wasn't a rugged cowboy like John Wayne. He wasn't a brooding brute like Brando. He was something new. He was vulnerable. He was neurotic. He was sensitive. He represented a new kind of masculinity that was emerging in the post-war era. A masculinity that was unsure of itself, that was searching. The film was released and the reviews were glowing. The critics saw it immediately. The New York Times praised his appealing freshness. Hollywood agents started circling like sharks in bloody water. But Perkins was wary. He returned to New York, to the theater. He landed the lead role in the Broadway play Tea and Sympathy. The irony of this casting is almost too painful to contemplate. In Tea and Sympathy, Perkins played Tom Lee, a sensitive boarding school student who is falsely accused of being homosexual and is brutally bullied by his classmates and teachers. The character is saved in the end by the headmaster's wife, who sleeps with him to prove his manhood. Perkins was playing his own biography. He was standing on stage every night, reliving the trauma of Brooks School, reliving the accusations of being a sissy, and enacting a fantasy where a mother figure cures him with sex. The play was a sensation. Perkins was a revelation. He poured his own pain into the role, and the audience wept for him. They thought he was acting. They didn't know he was screaming for help. Paramount Pictures saw the play. They didn't see a cry for help. They saw a gold mine. In 1955, they offered him a 7-year contract. It was the standard deal of the era. We own you. We tell you what to wear. We tell you who to date. We tell you what movies to make. In exchange, we will make you a god. Anthony Perkins stood at the crossroads. He could stay in New York, a respected theater actor, living a relatively quiet life. Or he could sign the paper and enter the dream factory. He could become the star his father never was. He could finally eclipse the ghost of Osgood. He picked up the pen. He signed his name. He didn't know it yet, but he had just signed his own death warrant. He was walking into a town that chewed up sensitive boys and spit out caricatures. He was walking into the era of the closet, the era of the tabloid, the era of the moral clause. He was bringing his secrets to a town where secrets were currency. Los Angeles in 1956 was not a city. It was a company town. It was a sun-drenched, sprawling industrial park where the product was human personality. When Anthony Perkins arrived at the gates of Paramount Pictures, he stepped into a machine that was running at maximum efficiency. The studio system was in its twilight years, but it was still a totalitarian regime. The studio didn't just employ you, they curated you. They fixed your teeth, they changed your hairline, they wrote your biography, and they dictated your sleeping habits. For a young man like Perkins, who had spent his entire life being molded by a dominant mother, this was a familiar nightmare. He had traded one controlling parent for a corporate board of directors. Paramount looked at Anthony Perkins and saw a puzzle piece they had been missing. They had the rugged heroes. They had the funny sidekicks. What they needed was the sensitivity. They needed a boy who could make teenage girls cry, a boy who triggered the maternal instinct in older women and the romantic fantasies of the younger ones. They looked at his lanky frame, his shy smile, his nervous energy, and they slapped a label on him: the next James Dean. It was a lazy comparison. Dean was a raw nerve, a rebel. Perkins was intellectual, patrician, and anxious. But in the marketing meetings, nuance didn't matter. They began the process of Anthony Perkins, the product. They set him up in a bachelor pad in the Hollywood Hills. They leased him a white convertible. They flooded the fan magazines with stories of his love for jazz, his lonely nights reading poetry, and his desperate search for the right girl. It was a masterclass in fiction. The Anthony Perkins presented to the American public was a carefully constructed avatar designed to be non-threateningly sexy. But the man behind the avatar was already suffocating. His first major test came with the film Friendly Persuasion, directed by the legendary William Wyler. It was a Civil War drama about a Quaker family torn between their pacifist faith and the violence of the war. Perkins was cast as Josh Birdwell, the son who struggles with his conscience before picking up a gun to defend his home. It was perfect casting, too perfect. Perkins wasn't acting, he was channeling his own internal war. The character of Josh was a boy trying to be a man, a boy terrified of violence but compelled to participate in it to earn respect. This paralleled Perkins' own life, a gay man trying to be a straight icon, a terrified boy trying to live up to the ghost of his war hero father. On set, Perkins was intense. He was a method actor before the term was trendy in the mainstream. He isolated himself. He wept for real in the emotional scenes. He brought a twitchy, neurotic reality to the screen that was startlingly modern. Gary Cooper, who played his father, was the old school of Hollywood, stoic, unmovable. Perkins was the new school, fragile, breakable. The contrast worked. The film was a smash hit. At the 1957 Academy Awards, Anthony Perkins was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. He didn't win, but he won something else: stardom. Overnight, he was A-list. He was the golden boy. But success in Hollywood is a double-edged sword. The industry saw what he did in Friendly Persuasion, the weeping, the stuttering, the neurotic sensitivity, and they said, do that again and again and again. He was pigeonholed. He became the go-to actor for troubled youths. If a script had a boy with daddy issues, they called Tony. If a script had a boy with a nervous breakdown, they called Tony. He was monetizing his own trauma. Every time he broke down on screen, he was selling a piece of his actual pain, and the audience was eating it up. Then came the absurdity. In the late 50s, if you were a teen idol, you had to sing. It didn't matter if you had a voice, you had to have a hit record. It was part of the cross-promotion synergy. Elvis had done it. Tab Hunter had done it. Now Paramount demanded Anthony Perkins do it. Perkins was a serious student of classical music. He loved jazz. He respected the art form. The idea of singing bubblegum pop songs was humiliating to him, but the contract was clear. He was dragged into the recording studio. They handed him songs with titles like Moonlight Swim and A Little Love. They were sugary, overproduced, vacuous tracks designed to be played at sock hops. Perkins sang them. He sang them with a breathy, intimate whisper that the producers loved because it sounded bedroom ready. The result was baffling. He actually had hits. Moonlight Swim climbed the Billboard charts in 1957. Suddenly, the serious Broadway actor, the son of Osgood Perkins, was appearing on American Bandstand, swaying awkwardly while screaming teenage girls tried to grab his jacket. He hated it. He hated the artificiality of it. He felt like a clown. In interviews, he would try to talk about theater or literature, But the reporters only wanted to know what his favorite color was or what he looked for in a girl. He was being infantilized. The industry was stripping away his dignity layer by layer, replacing the artist with a pinup doll. But the music career served a darker purpose for the studio. It reinforced his heterosexuality. A boy singing love songs to girls couldn't possibly be gay. It was a sonic beard, a cover story broadcast over the radio waves. While the magazines dubbed him the Bachelor of the Year, Anthony Perkins was living a life of high-stakes espionage. He was not alone in this deception. Hollywood in the 1950s was filled with men like him, the Velvet Mafia, as it was whispered. Rock Hudson, Tab Hunter, Montgomery Clift. They were the biggest stars in the world, and they were all hiding the same secret. Perkins found a kindred spirit in Tab Hunter. Tab Hunter was the blonde, athletic, all-American opposite to Perkins' dark, brooding intellectualism. They were the yin and yang of 50s male beauty, and they were lovers. Their relationship was a masterpiece of logistics. They would meet at private pool parties in the hills, away from the paparazzi. They would drive separate cars to the same location, arriving 10 minutes apart. They would go on double dates with unsuspecting actresses arranged by the studios, where they would be photographed holding hands with women while secretly kicking each other under the table. It was a thrill, but it was also a torment. They were competing for the same roles. The magazines constantly pitted them against each other. Who do you love more, Tony or Tab? They were lovers who were contractually obligated to be rivals. The fear of exposure was physical. The tabloid confidential was the terror of the industry. They paid bellboys, waiters, and gas station attendants for dirt. One wrong move, one intercepted phone call, and it was over. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, but emotionally true to the era, of a police raid on a gay party in the Hollywood Hills. When the sirens wailed, the biggest stars in the world, men who could command millions of dollars, scrambled over back fences and hid in shrubbery like common criminals, terrified that a single flashbulb would end their lives. Perkins lived with this adrenaline permanently spiking in his blood. This constant state of hiding had a corrosive effect on his soul. He began to view his sexuality not as a part of his humanity, but as a weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited. He didn't just hide it from the world, he tried to hide it from himself. By 1958, the pressure was becoming unbearable. The cognitive dissonance of being the world's desire while feeling like a monster was cracking him. He decided he needed to be fixed. He didn't go to a therapist to accept himself. He went to a therapist to kill the gay part of himself. He entered the office of Dr. Mildred Newman. History has not been kind to the psychiatric methods of the 1950s, and for good reason. What happened in those sessions was not healing, it was psychological mutilation. Newman, like many analysts of her time, adhered to the Freudian view that homosexuality was a case of arrested development, a failure to detach from the mother and identify with the father. For Perkins, this diagnosis was devastating because it confirmed his worst fear. It's my fault. I killed my father. I love my mother too much, and now I am broken. The treatment was brutal. It wasn't electric shock. It was subtler and arguably more damaging. It was shame therapy. Newman encouraged Perkins to view his attraction to men as a childish compulsion, a bad habit that could be broken with willpower. She ordered him to date women, not just for the cameras, but for real. She instructed him to force himself into sexual encounters with females, treating women as medicine to be taken. Perkins, desperate to be normal, obeyed. He engaged in clumsy, anxiety-ridden affairs with actresses. He would perform the act, then rush back to his analyst to report his progress, hoping for a gold star. But it didn't work. The desire for men didn't leave. It just curdled into self-loathing. He began to view his mind as a battlefield. Every time he looked at a man, he felt he had failed. Every time he failed to perform with a woman, he felt he was broken. He was paying a doctor to tear his psyche apart, believing that if he just hurt enough, he would eventually be healed. Despite the internal chaos, his career was soaring. In 1958, he returned to Broadway to star in Look Homeward, Angel. It was a triumph. He was nominated for a Tony Award. On stage, he was untouchable. He was playing Eugene Gant, a young writer breaking free from a controlling mother. Again, the art was imitating the life. The critics raved about his raw intensity, his quivering vulnerability. But off stage, he was becoming a ghost. He was known in New York circles as aloof, arrogant, and strange. He would walk into a party and stand in the corner staring at the floor. He would stutter uncontrollably when spoken to by strangers. He was a man who had forgotten how to interact with the world without a script. He was rich, he was famous, he was young, and he was the loneliest man in America. He bought a townhouse in Manhattan. He filled it with antiques, with heavy curtains, with silence. He would sit there alone, listening to classical music, reading books, and waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the studio to tell him who to be next, waiting for the cure to kick in. He was 27 years old. He had achieved everything his father had achieved and more, but he felt like a fraud. He felt like a hollow shell that the public projected their fantasies onto. And then the script arrived. It was 1959. Alfred Hitchcock was the most famous director in the world. He was coming off the massive success of North by Northwest. He was looking for his next project. He had found a pulp novel by Robert Bloch called Psycho. The studio hated it. They thought it was trash. They thought it was beneath him. But Hitchcock saw something in the story of Norman Bates. He saw a black comedy about American manners. He saw a story about a boy who loved his mother too much. Hitchcock didn't want a monster for the role of Norman. In the book, Norman was pudgy, middle-aged, and unappealing. Hitchcock wanted the opposite. He wanted a nice boy. He wanted the boy next door. He wanted the boy that every mother in America wanted their daughter to date. He looked at the landscape of Hollywood. He saw the pop songs. He saw the shy smile. He saw the nervous twitch and friendly persuasion. He saw the carefully constructed image of the non-threatening, sensitive bachelor. He sent the script to Anthony Perkins. Perkins read it. He read the lines of Norman Bates. He read the scenes where Norman stammers, where he defends his mother, where he hides in the shadows of the old house. He didn't see a villain. He saw a mirror. He saw the loneliness. He saw the domination of the mother. He saw the secrets. He saw the traps that people are born into. We scratch and claw, but only at the air, only at each other. And for all of it, we never budge an inch. Perkins agreed to the role for $40,000, a fraction of his usual fee. He didn't do it for the money. He did it because he understood Norman. He knew Norman. In a terrifying way, he was Norman. He signed the contract. He boarded the plane to Los Angeles. He thought he was just taking another job. He thought he was just playing another troubled youth. He had no idea that he was walking into a role that would cannibalize his identity. He had no idea that the nice boy image he and the studio had spent 5 years building was about to be used as the bait for the greatest cinematic trap in history. The golden boy era was over. The nightmare was about to begin. November 1959, Universal Studios, Stage 18. The set was cheap. Alfred Hitchcock, in a move of calculated frugality, was shooting Psycho with his television crew from Alfred Hitchcock Presents. He wanted it gritty, fast, and black and white. He wanted it to look like a newsreel from hell. Anthony Perkins stepped onto the set of the Bates Motel, not as a villain, but as a collaborator. Hitchcock, famously controlling with actors, did something unprecedented with Perkins. He gave him the keys to the asylum. He trusted Perkins's instincts. He saw that the young actor understood the pathology of Norman Bates better than the screenwriter did. In the original novel by Robert Bloch, Norman was 40 years old, overweight, alcoholic, and balding. He was repulsive. Perkins, along with Hitchcock, dismantled that image. They rebuilt Norman as a tragedy. Perkins brought his own obsessive attention to detail to the character. It was Perkins who suggested that Norman should chew on candy corn, a childish, sugary habit that made him seem like an oversized toddler. It was Perkins who decided that Norman should stutter only when he was nervous, creating a rhythm of speech that felt dangerously real. But the most brilliant and devastating choice was the sympathy. Perkins played Norman not as a predator, but as a victim. He played him as a dutiful son trapped in a gothic nightmare, trying to protect a mother who abused him. When he looked at Janet Leigh in the parlor scene, his eyes weren't filled with lust. They were filled with a desperate, lonely longing. He made the audience like Norman. He made the audience want to save Norman. This was the masterstroke. And it was the trap. By making Norman Bates so human, so vulnerable, so like him, Perkins wasn't just acting, he was merging. He was inviting the world to look at his own neuroses, his awkwardness, his mother issues, his sexual repression, and saying, "Isn't this terrifying?" The scene that defined his life, the scene that would be played in his obituary, the scene that changed cinema forever, the shower scene, didn't feature him. During the filming of The Murder of Marion Crane, Perkins was in New York, rehearsing for a Broadway play. He wasn't even in the state. Hitchcock used a stunt double for the silhouette of the killer. The knife-wielding figure in the dress wasn't Tony. It was a stand-in. Perkins returned later to film the aftermath, the cleanup, and this is where his performance is truly chilling. Watch him as he mops up the blood. He isn't frantic. He is efficient. He is annoyed like a housewife cleaning up a spill. He creates a mundane horror that is far more disturbing than the violence itself. He portrayed the banality of evil. He showed us that a monster doesn't have to be a foaming beast. A monster can be a polite young man who is just trying to keep the bathroom clean. When production wrapped in early 1960, Perkins felt a sense of relief. He thought he had done a good job in a small, weird thriller. He went back to his life. He went back to the theater. He went back to the glass closet. He had no idea that he had just placed a time bomb under the foundation of his career. June 16, 1960. Psycho premieres in New York City. The reaction was not just applause, it was hysteria. People fainted in the aisles. The police had to be called to control the crowds. Hitchcock had created a marketing campaign that demanded no one be admitted after the movie started, creating a frenzy of anticipation. And at the center of the storm was Anthony Perkins. The reviews were ecstatic, but they were also disturbing. The critics didn't just praise his acting, they were unnerved by it. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times called him soft and sinister. The accolades were laced with a suspicion that Perkins wasn't acting at all. Overnight, the teen idol was dead. The next James Dean was dead. The singer of Moonlight Swim was dead. In their place stood the psycho. Perkins felt the shift immediately. When he walked down the streets of Manhattan, people didn't smile at him anymore. They crossed the street. They stared. Women who had sent him fan mail proposing marriage now sent him letters asking if he was crazy. He had succeeded too well. He had terrified the world so profoundly that they couldn't separate the man from the role. The nice boy mask he had worn for 5 years had been ripped off, revealing something that the public found deeply unsettling. He was no longer a romantic lead. He was a creature. The industry's reaction to Psycho was a mixture of greed and revulsion. They loved the money, but they were embarrassed by the tawdriness of the genre. When the Academy Award nominations came out in 1961, Janet Leigh was nominated. Hitchcock was nominated. The cinematography was nominated. Anthony Perkins was ignored. It was a deliberate snub. The Academy, the guardians of Hollywood respectability, refused to acknowledge a performance that was so deeply subversive. They couldn't vote for a character who cross-dressed and murdered women. It was too deviant. This hurt Perkins deeply. He knew it was the best work of his life. He knew he had elevated a B-movie villain into a Shakespearean figure. But the silence from his peers told him everything he needed to know. You went too far. You showed us something we didn't want to see. The phone kept ringing, but the offers changed. The romantic comedies vanished. The heroic roles disappeared. Instead, he was sent scripts about arsonists, schizophrenics, and stalkers. He was 28 years old, and Hollywood had decided he was no longer a leading man. He was a character actor, code for freak. Perkins was intelligent. He saw the writing on the wall. He realized that if he stayed in Hollywood, he would spend the next 20 years playing Norman Bates clones. He decided to run. He looked to Europe. In the early 1960s, European cinema was experiencing a golden age. Directors like Fellini, Truffaut, and Litvak valued complexity over commercialism. They didn't care about his teen idol past. They didn't care about the psycho stigma. They saw a brilliant, intense actor. In 1961, he signed on to star in Goodbye Again opposite Ingrid Bergman. It was filmed in Paris. For Perkins, Paris was a liberation. It was far away from his mother. It was far away from the prying eyes of the American press. In Paris, he could breathe. In the film, he plays a young, aimless man who falls in love with an older woman. It was a romantic role, a desperate attempt to reclaim the territory he had lost. And in Europe, it worked. He won the Best Actor award at the Cannes Film Festival. He stood on the podium in Cannes, holding the trophy, thinking he had broken the curse. He thought, see, I can be romantic. I can be a lover. But when the film was released in America, it flopped. The American audiences refused to accept Norman Bates as a lover. They giggled when he kissed Ingrid Bergman. They waited for the knife. The die was cast. America would only allow him to be one thing. In 1962, Orson Welles came calling. Welles was adapting Franz Kafka's The Trial. He needed an actor to play Joseph K., a man arrested for a crime that is never explained, persecuted by a system he cannot understand, and eventually executed. Perkins took the role. It remains arguably the greatest performance of his career, rivaling even Psycho. Joseph K. is the ultimate victim. He is twitchy, paranoid, and suffocated by guilt for a crime he didn't commit. Perkins played him with a feverish intensity. Art was once again imitating life. Perkins was Joseph K. He was a gay man in the 1960s, persecuted by a society that deemed his existence illegal. He was a son persecuted by the memory of his father's death. He was an actor persecuted by the shadow of Norman Bates. The film is a nightmare of claustrophobia. Perkins moves through it like a trapped animal. There's a scene where Kay is surrounded by accusers, his eyes darting back and forth, sweat beading on his lip. It is the face of a man who knows he is guilty, not of a crime, but of being himself. Orson Welles later said that Perkins was the only actor who could have played Kay, because Perkins lived in a state of trial every day of his life. While he was filming in Europe, Perkins began to explore his sexuality with a freedom he had never known in Los Angeles. The 1960s were swinging. The sexual revolution was beginning to rumble. In Paris and London, the underground gay scene was vibrant. Perkins had affairs. He met dancers, photographers, artists. He fell in love. One of his most significant relationships was with Grover Dale, a talented dancer and choreographer. They met in a production of Green Willow on Broadway before Perkins left for Europe, and the relationship deepened over the years. For the first time, Perkins had something resembling a domestic partnership, but it had to be kept completely invisible. They lived together in New York, but they had an elaborate system of deception. If a reporter came to the house, Grover would pretend to be a roommate or a tenant. They couldn't hold hands in public. They couldn't go to dinner parties as a couple. This duality was exhausting. Being in love, sharing a life, sharing a bed, but having to deny the existence of that person to the world every single day. Perkins was still seeing Dr. Mildred Newman. He was still trying to be cured. He was living with a man he loved, yet paying a doctor to tell him that his love was a sickness. The cognitive dissonance was tearing him apart. He developed coping mechanisms. He became rigid about cleanliness. He became obsessed with order. He began to develop the idiosyncratic tics that would later define his public persona: the nervous laughter, the sudden silences. He was a man holding his breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. By the late 1960s, Perkins returned to Hollywood. The landscape had changed. The studio system had collapsed. The new Hollywood of Scorsese, Coppola, and Hopper was emerging. Perkins was an elder statesman at 36, but he was also a relic. He was stuck in the weird limbo of being a has-been, who was also a cult icon. In 1968, he starred in Pretty Poison. It is a cult classic, a dark, twisted neo-noir. He plays a disturbed young man who meets a cheerleader who is even crazier than he is. It was a brilliant deconstruction of the psycho persona. Perkins leaned into the creepiness. He weaponized his own typecasting. He showed that he could be funny, self-aware, and dangerous. The critics loved it. Perkins is back, they said, but the box office was lukewarm. The audience was busy watching The Graduate and Easy Rider. They wanted new heroes. Dustin Hoffman was the new neurotic boy in town. Perkins was yesterday's news. He began to drift. He took roles in bad horror movies. He appeared on television game shows to pay the bills. He seemed lost. The cure wasn't working. The career was stalling. The mother was still calling. He approached his 40th birthday with a sense of dread. In the youth-obsessed culture of gay life in Hollywood, 40 is the death knell. He felt he was aging out of his boyish charm, and he had nothing to replace it with. He was a man without an identity. He wasn't Norman Bates. He wasn't a teen idol. He wasn't a straight man. He wasn't an openly gay man. He was a ghost floating between worlds. And then in the early 70s, he made a decision that would shock everyone who knew him. A decision that seemed to come out of nowhere, but was actually the desperate last stand of a man trying to build a fortress against the chaos. He decided to get married. 1973 was a year of rupture. For years, Anthony Perkins had lived in a quiet domestic equilibrium with dancer Grover Dale. It was a shadow marriage, unacknowledged by the law and invisible to the public, but it was real. It was the closest thing to stability Perkins had ever known. Then, the floor fell out. Grover Dale fell in love with a woman, actress Anita Morris, and decided to get married. For Perkins, this was a cataclysm. It wasn't just a breakup, it was an existential invalidation. The man he loved was choosing normalcy. The man he loved was crossing the line into the safety of heterosexual respectability, leaving Perkins alone in the dark. Perkins was 41 years old. He was heartbroken, terrified of aging alone, and acutely aware that his career was drifting. He looked at what Grover did, and he made a calculation. If normalcy was the only way to survive, he would be the most normal man in Hollywood. He didn't just dip his toe into the dating pool, he dove in. Enter Barry Berenson. Barry Berenson was American royalty. The granddaughter of the legendary fashion designer Elsa Schiaparelli and the sister of model Marissa Berenson. She was 25 years old, vibrant, bohemian, and stunning. She was a photographer who moved through the jet-set circles of New York and Europe. She had had a crush on Anthony Perkins since she was a teenager. To her, he wasn't the creepy killer. He was the misunderstood genius. She saw the vulnerability and wanted to heal it. When they met, the chemistry was immediate, though unconventional. Barry was the aggressor. She pursued him. She offered him something he had never had: unconditional acceptance. She didn't care about the men in his past. She didn't care about the neuroses. She offered him a sanctuary. On August 9th, 1973, in a ceremony that shocked the tabloids, Anthony Perkins married Barry Berenson on Cape Cod. The press went wild. People magazine ran the photos. Norman Bates finds a bride. It was the perfect narrative pivot. The weird loner had been tamed. The bachelor had finally settled down. But inside the industry, eyebrows were raised. The lavender marriage was a Hollywood tradition, gay stars marrying lesbian or compliant women to protect their careers. Was this that? The truth was far more complicated. It was not a sham. Perkins loved Barry. He loved her energy, her warmth, and the safety she provided. But he was not suddenly straight. He was a man with a fluid, complex sexuality who had made a choice to commit to a woman. However, this commitment came with a heavy price. It required a fortress. The Perkins household in the Hollywood Hills became a study in contradiction. To the outside world, it was the Garden of Eden. They were the bohemian power couple. They threw dinner parties for the elite: Spielberg, Scorsese, the creme de la creme. They were witty, charming, and photogenic. But the walls were high. Barry Berenson took on a role that was part wife, part mother, and part warden. She understood, perhaps implicitly, that the foundation of their life was fragile. She became the gatekeeper. She managed the press. She deflected the rumors. When Perkins would have his moods, dark, silent depressions, where he would retreat into himself for days, Barry was the buffer. She kept the world away. She normalized the abnormal. But she was also unwittingly an enabler of his suppression. By helping him construct this perfect heterosexual facade, she was helping him bury his true self deeper. The cure of Dr. Mildred Newman seemed to have worked, but only because Barry was doing the heavy lifting of maintaining the illusion. Perkins was playing the role of the husband with the same intensity he played Joseph K. or Norman Bates. He was dedicated, he was convincing, but he was always, on some level, performing. If the marriage was complex, the fatherhood was pure. In 1974, their first son, Osgood, was born. 2 years later, Elvis arrived. For Anthony Perkins, holding his sons was a spiritual experience. For the first time in his life, he was the father, not the son. He had the power to rewrite the script of his own childhood. He was determined not to be Osgood Perkins. He wouldn't be the distant God who vanished. He would be present. He would be tactile. He was a loving, doting father. He poured all the love he had been denied into his boys. This was the happiest period of his life. The demons seemed to recede. The guilt of his father's death began to fade in the laughter of his own children. He felt for the first time that he was a good man. But Hollywood doesn't let you just be a dad. It needs you to be a commodity. And the commodity they wanted was still Norman. By the early 1980s, the slasher genre was exploding. Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street were making millions. and they all owed a debt to Psycho. Universal Studios looked at their vault and realized they owned the grandfather of them all. They decided to make a sequel, Psycho 2. Initially, they didn't even want Perkins. They thought about recasting or making it a TV movie. But the script was good. It was a thoughtful exploration of mental illness and gaslighting. Perkins was at a crossroads. He had spent 20 years running from Norman Bates. He had done art films in Europe, plays in New York, and avant-garde theater to prove he was more than a killer. But the phone wasn't ringing. He had a family to support. He had a mortgage. And he was over 50. He stopped running. He agreed to return to the Bates Motel. It was a moment of capitulation, but also of reclamation. He told the producers, "If you're going to do it, I want to be involved. I want to protect him." Protect him. Perkins didn't see Norman as a monster. He saw him as an old friend. He saw him as a victim. Psycho 2 was a surprise hit. Perkins gave a nuanced, heartbreaking performance. He played Norman as a man trying desperately to be sane in an insane world. The audience rooted for him. The success brought cash, stability, and a renewed fame. But it also locked the cage door shut. There was no escaping Norman now. They were fused. Perkins began to joke in interviews. "I don't know where I end, and Norman begins." It was a joke, but it wasn't funny. Emboldened by the success, Universal greenlit Psycho 3. This time, Perkins made a demand. "I want to direct." The studio agreed. Psycho 3 is Anthony Perkins' unfiltered confession. It is a chaotic, stylish, deeply weird film. It is drenched in religious guilt, sexual confusion, and dark humor. There is a scene where Norman falls in love with a suicidal nun who looks like Marion Crane. It is a fever dream of Perkins' own psyche. He explored the themes of purity versus desire, the silence of God, and the inevitability of madness. The film opens with Norman screaming, "There is no God." It was Perkins screaming at the universe. As a director, he was kind, patient, and brilliant. But the film was too weird for the mainstream. It failed at the box office. The failure hurt him. He had shown the world his soul, and the world had shrugged. He realized that the audience didn't want Anthony Perkins the artist. They just wanted the guy with the knife. The late 1980s were a strange twilight time. Perkins was a legacy star. He was doing the horror conventions, appearing on talk shows, playing the elder statesman of fear. He seemed healthy. He was still handsome, though his face had thinned. He was active. He and Barry were still the golden couple attending galas, raising their teenage boys. But the world around them was dying. The AIDS crisis was decimating the creative industries. New York and Los Angeles were becoming graveyards. Every week, another friend disappeared, another memorial service, another whispered rumor. Perkins watched it with a detached horror. He had been straight for 15 years. He had played by the rules. He had done the therapy. He had married the woman. He had raised the kids. He thought he was safe. He thought he had outsmarted the fate that had befallen so many of his former lovers. He believed in the narrative he had constructed. He believed that his marriage had inoculated him against his past. But biology does not care about narratives. It does not care about cover stories. The virus had likely been in his system for years, lying dormant, waiting. The tabloids were hungry. They needed a new victim. Rock Hudson was dead. Liberace was dead. They needed a new face for the plague. The National Enquirer, a publication that specialized in destroying lives for 95 cents a copy, ran a story. It was a blind item, but the details were specific. An aging horror icon was sick. Perkins saw the headline while standing in a grocery store checkout line. Standing there with a cart full of milk and bread, surrounded by mundane suburban life, and seeing your own death sentence printed in neon yellow letters next to the chewing gum. He felt the cold wash of terror. Not just the fear of death. Perkins had lived with ghosts his whole life, but the fear of exposure. He went to the doctor. He didn't use his real name. He gave a vial of blood. When the results came back, the glass fortress shattered. HIV positive. The silence in the room was deafening. The cure had failed. The marriage hadn't saved him. The mask had slipped. And now the real horror movie began. Not a movie about a killer in a motel, but a movie about a man trying to hide a plague from the entire world while the cameras were still rolling. The diagnosis in 1990 didn't just change Anthony Perkins' future, it rewrote his past. Standing in the sterile light of the doctor's office, or perhaps staring at the crumpled tabloid page that had hinted at his doom before his own physician did, Perkins felt the brutal weight of irony crashing down on him. For 30 years he had been haunted by a fictional ghost, the mother in the fruit cellar, the voice of Norman Bates. Now he was haunted by a biological reality that was far more lethal than any screenwriter's imagination. The virus was not just a medical condition. In 1990, it was a moral indictment. To be HIV positive in Hollywood was to be branded with a scarlet letter that signified deviance, recklessness, and uninsurability. For Perkins, the shame was compounded by the specific nature of his celebrity. He wasn't just an actor, he was the face of Psycho. He was the man who had terrified America by playing a sexually repressed, cross-dressing murderer. If the public found out that Anthony Perkins, the man behind Norman Bates, was dying of the gay plague, the distinction between the actor and the monster would dissolve completely. The tabloids wouldn't treat it as a tragedy. They would treat it as a punchline. See? We told you he was sick. We told you he was dangerous. The panic that set in was cold and absolute. There were no tears, only strategy. Anthony and Barry retreated into their fortress in the Hollywood Hills, pulling up the drawbridge. They made a pact that would define the next 2 years of their lives. Silence. Absolute, impenetrable silence. They weren't just hiding a sickness. They were hiding a lifestyle, a history, and a truth that Perkins had spent a lifetime running from. The glass closet he had lived in for decades was suddenly reinforced with steel. Why the secrecy? Why not come out like Magic Johnson would do a year later and become a hero? Because Anthony Perkins wasn't an athlete. He was a character actor in a declining market, and the economics of Hollywood are ruthless. The villain of this chapter is the completion bond. As with Brad Davis, Perkins faced the terrifying reality that an HIV diagnosis meant he was uninsurable. If he couldn't get insurance, he couldn't get work. If he couldn't work, the cash flow stopped. And the Perkins lifestyle, the beautiful home, the private schools for Osgood and Elvis, the therapy, the travel, required a constant infusion of money. Perkins was terrified of leaving his family destitute. He looked at Barry, who had sacrificed her own youth and bohemian freedom to be his anchor, and he looked at his 2 teenage sons, who worshipped him. He couldn't leave them with nothing but a scandal. He had to keep earning. This necessitated a performance more grueling than anything he had done on stage. He had to play the role of healthy, heterosexual Anthony Perkins while his T-cell count was plummeting. He had to walk into meetings with producers, shake their hands firmly, smile with his capped teeth, and project an energy he didn't feel. He had to lie on medical forms. He had to cheat physicals. He was a spy in his own industry, stealing paychecks from a system that would have exiled him instantly had they known the truth. Barry Berenson's transformation during this period was heartbreaking. She had entered the marriage as a free spirit, a photographer, a lover of life. Now she became the keeper of the gate. She had to filter the phone calls. She had to lie to their closest friends. When people asked why Tony looked so thin, she had to invent diets. When they asked why he was tired, she had to invent insomnia. She was living in a state of high alert anxiety, terrified that a slip of the tongue or a misplaced prescription bottle would bring the house of cards down. The intimacy of their marriage shifted from romantic partnership to a siege mentality. They were soldiers in a foxhole fighting a war against the world. But inside the house, a quiet tragedy was unfolding. Perkins, stripped of his vanity and his public persona, became incredibly tender. He spent hours with his sons. He wasn't the distant Osgood Perkins. He was present, tactile, and desperate to imprint his love on them before he vanished. He watched movies with them. He talked to them about art and life, trying to cram 20 years of fatherhood into the few months he had left. He was racing against the clock, trying to build a legacy of love that could withstand the storm of scandal he knew would come after his death. In 1991, while Perkins was fighting for his life in secret, a film was released that felt like a cruel mockery of his entire career. The Silence of the Lambs swept the world. Anthony Hopkins played Hannibal Lecter, a sophisticated, terrifying psychopath. Hopkins was celebrated. He was called a genius. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor. The industry threw roses at his feet for playing a monster. Perkins watched this from the sidelines, wasting away. The irony was suffocating. When Perkins had played a psychopath in 1960, the industry had recoiled. They had snubbed him. They had typecast him. Now, 30 years later, playing a psychopath was high art. He saw the hypocrisy clearly. Hopkins was allowed to be a monster on screen because everyone knew he was a safe, respectable British actor off-screen. Perkins was never afforded that safety. Because Perkins was different, his performance was seen as a symptom, not a skill. He had walked so Anthony Hopkins could run, but Perkins was left to die in the dust, unrecognized and unrewarded. It was a final bitter pill to swallow. Seeing the genre he helped invent be celebrated while he was being erased. By late 1991, the physical toll was becoming impossible to hide. The virus was aggressive. Perkins developed the AIDS look, the hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes, the skeletal frame. The boyish face that had defined him was collapsing in on itself. He couldn't go to Cedars-Sinai. He couldn't sit in a public waiting room. He had to seek treatment in the shadows. He used aliases. He paid in cash. He visited doctors who operated with the discretion of mob fixers. Every trip to the doctor was a covert operation. He would wear a hat pulled low, sunglasses, and a scarf, huddled in the back of a car driven by Barry. He lived in terror of the National Enquirer photographers. He knew they were hunting him. He knew there was a bounty on the deathbed photo of Norman Bates. This paranoia added a layer of psychological torture to his physical suffering. He couldn't just be sick. He had to be vigilant. He couldn't just rest. He had to hide. The shame of the disease was as debilitating as the disease itself. He felt dirty. He felt that his illness was a confirmation of everything his mother, his therapist, and society had told him about himself. You are wrong. You are broken. You are doomed. Despite the horror, he kept working. In 1992, he signed on for In the Deep Woods, a TV movie. It was a paycheck. It was health insurance. The shoot was an ordeal. He was so weak he could barely stand. Between takes, he would collapse in his trailer, shivering. Makeup artists had to work overtime to put color back into his gray skin. They had to pad his clothes to hide the fact that he was starving to death. But when the director called action, Anthony Perkins did what he had always done. He turned it on. The eyes flashed. The voice found its rhythm. He summoned the last reserves of his energy to perform. It was a heroic act of will, a dying man forcing his body to obey him one last time for the sake of his family. He knew this was the end. There were no more comebacks, no more reinventions. He was playing out the string. As the summer of 1992 approached, the fortress walls began to close in. He stopped going out. He stopped answering the phone. He lay in his bedroom, surrounded by books, by the silence of the hills, and by the ghosts of the past. The completion bond had been satisfied. The movies were done. Now, there was only the waiting. By the summer of 1992, the Perkins residence in the Hollywood Hills had ceased to be a home. It had become a bunker. The world outside was bright with California sunshine, but inside, the curtains were drawn tight against the glare. The phone, once the lifeline of a movie star, sat silent or was answered with terrified caution by Barry. The circle of trust had shrunk to a microscopic point. Only a handful of people knew the truth. The rest, lifelong friends, directors, fellow actors, were met with a wall of polite evasion. Tony is resting. Tony has a flu that won't go away. Tony is focusing on writing. It was a siege, and the enemy wasn't just the virus, it was the truth. Perkins spent his final months in a state of suspended animation, trapped between the desire for comfort and the terror of discovery. He wanted to say goodbye to people. He wanted to hug his friends, but he couldn't risk it. If he invited someone over and they saw his skeletal frame, the rumors would start. If the rumors started, the press would descend. And if the press descended, the Norman Bates with AIDS headline would become the epitaph of his entire existence. So, he chose isolation. He chose to die alone with his secrets rather than live his final days in the open. It was a heartbreaking calculation. Dignity purchased at the cost of connection. He was rewriting the script of his own death, editing out the cast of characters until only the immediate family remained. In the quiet of the bedroom, stripped of the celebrity and the masks, Anthony Perkins focused on his only remaining audience, Osgood and Elvis. His sons were teenagers now, old enough to understand that their father was fading, but perhaps too young to grasp the full complex weight of the history dying with him. Perkins didn't burden them with the sordid details of the completion bonds or the Velvet Mafia. He didn't confess the dark struggles of the conversion therapy. He simply loved them. He became a distiller of wisdom. He tried to pass on everything he had learned about art, kindness, and survival in breathless, quiet conversations. He watched movies with them, his eyes still lighting up at a great performance, teaching them to see the craft he loved. There was a profound sadness in these moments. Perkins was looking at his boys and seeing the future he wouldn't be a part of. He was Osgood Perkins all over again, the father leaving too soon. The cycle was repeating, but with a difference. Osgood had been distant. Tony was present until the very last second his consciousness allowed. He was breaking the generational curse of emotional abandonment, even as his body failed him. As September approached, the physical devastation became absolute. Pneumonia had set in. His breathing was a ragged labor. The man who had once possessed the agile grace of a dancer was now confined to his bed, too weak to lift his head. Yet the paranoia remained. Even in this state, there was a fear of the leak, a nurse who might talk, a delivery person who might see something. The shame that Dr. Mildred Newman had planted in his brain 30 years earlier was still blooming in the dark. He felt that his sickness was a visual manifestation of his sin. He refused to go to the hospital. He knew that hospitals were porous. Orderlies sold stories. Nurses sold records. He told Barry, "I want to die here." It wasn't just about comfort. It was about control. In his own bed, he could control the lighting. He could control who saw him. He could maintain the illusion of Anthony Perkins, the dignified actor, rather than the AIDS victim on a gurney. Barry Berenson became the steel spine of the household. She nursed him with a fierce protective love. She washed him, she fed him, she held him when the night sweats came. She was the only person who saw the full horror of the decline, and she bore witness without flinching. She was the keeper of his dignity when he could no longer hold it himself. The end came on a Saturday. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of medicine and the impending silence of death. Anthony Perkins, 60 years old, took his final breath. He died quietly. There was no cinematic speech, no final revelation, just the cessation of a struggle that had lasted for 6 decades. The heart that had beaten anxiously through boarding school bullying, through Broadway applause, through the terror of the closet, and through the screams of Psycho, finally stopped. For a moment there was peace. The mask could finally be taken off. He didn't have to be Norman Bates anymore. He didn't have to be the teen idol. He didn't have to be the straight husband. He was just a body at rest. But for Barry, the war wasn't over. The second Tony died, the clock started ticking on the cover-up. She had to manage the release of the information before the tabloids got wind of the hearse. They waited. They didn't call the press immediately. They secured the house. They prepared the boys. When the statement was finally released, it was a masterpiece of controlled narrative. It acknowledged that he died of complications from AIDS. But it was the personal statement Perkins had prepared or that Barry helped craft that landed like a bombshell. It was the first time he had spoken openly, and he only did it from the grave. I chose not to go public about this because, to misquote a line from Casablanca, I'm not much at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of one old actor don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. He was deflecting to the end, self-deprecating, humble, quoting a movie. But then, the knife twisted. I have learned more about love, selflessness, and human understanding from the people I have met in this great adventure in the world of AIDS than I ever did in the cutthroat, competitive world in which I spent my life. It was a polite, gentlemanly, but devastating indictment. He was telling Hollywood, "You didn't teach me love. You taught me fear. The sick people, the outcasts, the ones you shunned, they taught me humanity." The news hit the wires. The world gasped. Norman Bates is dead. Anthony Perkins had AIDS. The shock wasn't just that he was gone. It was the realization of the double life he had led. The puzzle pieces suddenly clicked into place for the public. The rumors, the bachelor years, the sensitive roles. But the industry didn't have time to mourn. They had to spin. Universal Studios released statements praising his talent. Agents expressed their sorrow. The very people who would have crossed his name off a casting list a week ago were now weeping crocodile tears for the legend. The tragedy of the Perkins family did not end with Anthony's last breath in 1992. It felt as though the universe had written a script too cruel even for Hitchcock to direct. Barry Berenson, the woman who had been the jailer, the nurse, and the savior, the woman who had spent 20 years building a wall of silence to protect her husband's dignity, tried to rebuild her life. She had fulfilled her duty. She had kept the secrets. She had saved the estate. 9 years later, on the morning of September 11th, 2001, Barry boarded American Airlines Flight 11 in Boston to return home to Los Angeles. She was sitting in the first film star's seat. That plane was the first to crash into the World Trade Center. With that final violent stroke of fate, the two guardians of the Perkins mystery were gone. The parents were erased, leaving Osgood and Elvis, the two boys they had fought so hard to protect, standing alone in the wreckage of history. It was a devastating, almost biblical conclusion to a family saga defined by loss. When we strip away the black and white footage, the screeching violins, and the tabloid headlines, what remains of Anthony Perkins? We see a man who was the ultimate casualty of the human need to please. He died hiding in his own home, ashamed of a virus, ashamed of his past, terrified of being found out. It is the most heartbreaking ending imaginable for an artist who gave so much truth to the screen. The true horror story of Anthony Perkins isn't about a killer with a knife. It is about a frightened boy standing in the spotlight, smiling, that jagged, nervous smile, waiting for permission to finally be himself, permission that never came.